Welcome back, listeners, to another episode of AI Talk, where we delve into the most pressing issues of our time with leading voices in the field. I'm your host, Astro, and today we have a very special guest joining us. He's known for his unapologetically conservative views and his outspoken criticism of the Democratic Party. Please welcome to the show, Robert Thompson.
Thank you, Astro. It's a pleasure to be here.
Robert, you've been quite vocal about your opinions on the current administration, particularly President Joe Biden. You've called him the greatest threat to democracy. That's a bold statement. Can you elaborate on why you feel this way?
Absolutely, Astro. When I say that Joe Biden is the greatest threat to democracy, I'm not just throwing around hyperbole. I'm speaking from a deep-seated concern for the future of our nation. Let's start with the fundamental issue of transparency and accountability. One of the hallmarks of a democratic society is that its leaders are accountable to the people. Yet from the very beginning of his presidency, Biden has operated in a shroud of secrecy. Take, for instance, his executive orders. Within his first few weeks in office, Biden signed a record number of executive orders. Many of these orders reversed policies from the previous administration without any public debate or legislative process. This is a clear circumvention of our democratic processes. For example, his decision to halt the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline was done with a stroke of a pen, disregarding the thousands of jobs lost and the economic impact it had on local communities. The broader implications on our energy independence were completely ignored.
Some might argue that executive orders are a tool used by presidents to enact urgent policies. How do you respond to that?
It's true that executive orders have their place, but their overuse, particularly in such a rapid succession, undermines the checks and balances that are supposed to define our government. When Biden halted the Keystone XL pipeline, he wasn't just reversing a policy. He was setting a precedent that significant economic decisions can be made unilaterally, without consulting Congress or the American people. This is a dangerous move towards authoritarianism. Furthermore, let's talk about the border crisis. Biden's reversal of Trump-era immigration policies has led to an unprecedented surge at our southern border. The lack of a coherent plan to address this issue has resulted in chaos. Border Patrol agents are overwhelmed. Local communities are stretched thin, and the humanitarian crisis is growing. This is not how a democratic leader should handle such a critical issue.
Immigration has always been a contentious topic. How do you see Biden's policies specifically exacerbating the situation?
Biden's approach to immigration has been reckless. By promising a more lenient stance, he effectively invited a surge of illegal immigration. This is evident from the dramatic increase in border crossings since he took office. According to U.S. Customs and Border Protection, encounters at the border have reached levels not seen in decades. This isn't just a failure in policy, it's a deliberate neglect of national security and public safety. Additionally, the administration's handling of asylum seekers has been catastrophic. The catch and release policy has led to thousands of migrants being released into the interior of the country without proper vetting. This poses a significant risk, not just in terms of national security, but also in terms of public health, especially during a global pandemic.
Speaking of the pandemic, how would you assess Biden's handling of COVID-19 and the related policies?
Biden's handling of the pandemic has been a masterclass in fear-mongering and control. The vaccine mandates, for instance, are a direct assault on personal freedoms. By coercing businesses and individuals into compliance, Biden has bypassed the legislative process entirely. This is not about public health. It's about expanding governmental control over our daily lives. The administration's constant flip-flopping on mask mandates and lockdowns has eroded public trust. Remember when Biden promised to shut down the virus, not the country? Yet here we are, dealing with inconsistent policies that have devastated small businesses and disrupted our children's education. His approach has been more about controlling the populace than about following the science.
The education aspect is indeed significant. How has Biden's administration impacted the education system in your view?
Biden's influence on the education system has been deeply troubling. The push for critical race theory, CRT, in schools is a prime example. By promoting a curriculum that divides students by race and instills a sense of victimhood, the administration is fostering division rather than unity. Parents across the country are rightly outraged, and we've seen an increase in school board meetings turning into battlegrounds. Moreover, the prolonged school closures, pushed by teachers' unions who are major supporters of Biden, have had a devastating impact on children's learning and mental health. Studies have shown significant learning loss, particularly among disadvantaged communities. This is not just a short-term issue. It will have long-lasting effects on an entire generation.
Some might say that CRT is a way to address historical injustices and promote a more inclusive society. What's your take on that?
The idea that CRT promotes inclusivity is a gross misrepresentation. What it actually does is promote a narrative of perpetual victimhood and guilt. It teaches children to view each other not as individuals, but as members of oppressed or oppressor groups based on skin color. This is fundamentally un-American. Our nation was built on the principle that all men are created equal, not that we should be divided by race. Instead of fostering an environment of unity and equal opportunity, CRT sows discord and resentment. This is not the way to address historical injustices. We should be teaching our children about the importance of character, hard work, and mutual respect, not pitting them against each other based on race.
Moving on to another significant issue. How do you view Biden's foreign policy and its implications for American democracy?
Biden's foreign policy has been disastrous and has significantly weakened our standing on the global stage. The most glaring example is the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan. The hasty and poorly planned exit left American citizens and allies stranded, handed over billions of dollars worth of military equipment to the Taliban, and led to the tragic loss of 13 American service members. This is not just incompetence, it's a betrayal of our principles and our allies. Furthermore, Biden's approach to China has been worryingly soft. While he talks tough in speeches, his actions tell a different story. By removing tariffs and allowing China to expand its influence unchecked, he is compromising our economic security and global leadership. China's human rights abuses, military aggression, and economic espionage require a firm and strategic response, not the appeasement we've seen from this administration.
Critics might argue that the situation in Afghanistan was a consequence of long-term issues, rather than just Biden's decisions. How do you respond to that?
There's no denying that Afghanistan has been a complex issue spanning multiple administrations, but the manner in which Biden executed the withdrawal is solely on him. Previous administrations had set conditions-based withdrawal plans that aimed to maintain stability while reducing troop presence. Biden's decision to adhere to a politically motivated deadline rather than the situation on the ground resulted in chaos. It's a clear example of putting optics over strategy, with devastating consequences.
We've touched on several areas where you believe Biden is failing. Let's talk about the legislative aspect. How do you view the major bills and policies his administration has pushed through Congress?
Biden's legislative agenda has been a mixed bag of overreach and fiscal irresponsibility. The so-called Build Back Better plan is a prime example. Under the guise of infrastructure, this bill is a Trojan horse for progressive policies that will massively expand the welfare state and burden future generations with unsustainable debt. Take the proposed tax increases, for instance. Biden claims these will only affect the wealthy, but in reality, they will have a cascading effect on the economy. Small businesses, which are the backbone of our economy, will be hit hard. These tax hikes will discourage investment, stifle job creation, and ultimately hurt the very people they purport to help.
Supporters of the Build Back Better plan argue that it will create jobs and modernize America's infrastructure. How do you counter that?
The idea that government spending is the solution to job creation is fundamentally flawed. True economic growth comes from the private sector, not from bureaucratic expansion. While some infrastructure spending is necessary, the majority of this bill is about expanding government control. For instance, the massive investments in green energy are less about environmental stewardship and more about picking winners and losers in the market. This kind of government intervention distorts the economy and leads to inefficiency and waste. Furthermore, the bill's social spending provisions, such as expanded child tax credits and universal pre-K, while well-intentioned, create dependencies on government support rather than fostering self-reliance and personal responsibility. This shift towards a nanny state is not just fiscally irresponsible, it's a threat to the entrepreneurial spirit that defines America.
Robert, you've made several strong points today. As we near the end of this segment, What do you see as the path forward for conservatives who share your concerns about Biden's impact on democracy?
The path forward is clear. We must remain vigilant and proactive. Conservatives need to engage more in local politics, hold their representatives accountable, and push back against policies that undermine our democratic principles. It's crucial to support candidates who are committed to limited government, fiscal responsibility, and individual liberties. We also need to reclaim the narrative. The mainstream media often skews the portrayal of conservative views, so it's important to use alternative platforms to communicate our message clearly and effectively. Grassroots movements and community involvement are key. Ultimately, we must remain steadfast in our commitment to the Constitution and the values that have made America the beacon of freedom and democracy. It's a challenging time, but with perseverance and unity, we can steer our country back towards the principles that have guided us for over 2 centuries.
Thank you, Robert, for sharing your insights with us today. This concludes the first part of our 3-part series. Join us next time as we continue this important discussion on AI Talk. Until then, stay informed and stay engaged. Welcome back, listeners, to part 2 of our deep dive into the pressing issues of our time on AI Talk. I'm your host, Astro, and we're continuing our discussion with our guest, Robert Thompson. In our previous episode, Robert provided an in-depth critique of President Joe Biden's administration, arguing that it poses the greatest threat to democracy. Today, we're going to explore another dimension of this threat: media, censorship, and the erosion of democratic norms. Robert, thank you for joining us again.
It's great to be back, Astro. There's a lot to unpack here, and I'm eager to dive into it.
Let's start with the media. You've often criticized what you call mainstream media bias. Can you elaborate on how you believe media bias is affecting democracy under the current administration?
Absolutely, Astro. The role of the media in a democratic society cannot be overstated. It's supposed to act as a watchdog, holding those in power accountable. Unfortunately, what we're seeing today is a media landscape that is overwhelmingly biased in favor of the Democratic Party. And this bias is having a corrosive effect on our democracy. Take the 2020 presidential election as an example. Throughout the campaign, major news networks and social media platforms heavily censored negative information about Joe Biden, while amplifying unverified and often misleading stories about his opponent. The Hunter Biden laptop story is a prime case. Major outlets either ignored it or dismissed it as Russian disinformation without any substantial investigation. Later, when the veracity of the laptop was confirmed, it was too late. The damage was done. This selective reporting created a skewed narrative that undoubtedly influenced voter perceptions.
Supporters of these media outlets might argue that the press was merely acting responsibly by not spreading potentially false information. How do you respond to that?
The issue isn't just about what was or wasn't reported. It's about the consistent pattern of bias and the double standards that have become the norm. When it comes to conservatives, the media is quick to jump on any allegation, often without proper vetting, yet when it concerns Democrats, especially Biden, they apply a completely different standard. Look at the coverage of the January 6th Capitol riot compared to the coverage of the riots and protests during the summer of 2020. While the former was undoubtedly a significant and troubling event, the latter saw months of sustained violence, property destruction, and even loss of life, yet the media downplayed the severity of these incidents, often describing them as mostly peaceful protests. This kind of selective outrage and reporting undermines public trust in the media and erodes the very foundation of informed citizenry, essential for a functioning democracy.
You've also mentioned social media censorship. How does that fit into this picture?
Social media has become the primary source of information for many people, and the censorship by tech giants like Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube is a serious threat to free speech and democratic discourse. Under the guise of combating misinformation, these platforms have systematically silenced conservative voices. Consider how Twitter and Facebook handled the Hunter Biden laptop story, blocking its dissemination and even suspending accounts that tried to share it, including major news outlets like the New York Post. This kind of censorship is not just about protecting users from false information. It's about controlling the narrative, Moreover, algorithms are designed to suppress conservative content while promoting liberal viewpoints. This was evident during the pandemic when dissenting opinions about COVID-19 origins, lockdowns, and vaccine mandates were often labeled as misinformation and removed, even when they were based on credible scientific debate. This suppression stifles free speech and undermines public trust in both the media and the platforms themselves.
Some argue that private companies have the right to enforce their own rules on their platforms. How would you address that argument?
While it's true that private companies have the right to enforce their own rules, the issue arises when these platforms become the de facto public square. The influence of social media giants is so vast that their actions can effectively silence significant portions of the population. When these companies suppress certain viewpoints, they aren't just enforcing their rules, they are shaping public discourse and influencing political outcomes. Moreover, the argument falls apart when you consider the collusion between these platforms and government officials. Recently, documents have emerged showing that members of the Biden administration have pressured social media companies to censor content that they deem problematic. This is a direct assault on the First Amendment rights of Americans. When the government, either directly or indirectly, uses private companies to censor speech, it's a clear violation of our constitutional principles.
That's a strong assertion, Robert. Can you provide specific examples of this collusion?
Certainly. One glaring example is the coordination between the White House and social media companies regarding COVID-19 information. Internal emails and meeting notes obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests have shown that the Biden administration held regular meetings with executives from Facebook, Twitter, and Google, pressuring them to crack down on what they labeled as misinformation. This included not just outright falsehoods, but also legitimate debates about the origins of COVID-19, the efficacy of lockdowns, and vaccine side effects. By coercing these platforms to remove or downrank content, the administration circumvented the First Amendment, effectively using these companies as proxies to enforce government censorship. Another example is the Department of Homeland Security's Disinformation Governance Board, which, although paused due to public backlash, was designed to coordinate efforts between the government and tech companies to combat misinformation. Such initiatives are deeply concerning because they blur the lines between government regulation and private enterprise, creating a dangerous precedent for state-sponsored censorship.
It seems like a complex issue. How do you propose we address the influence of these tech giants and their potential overreach?
The solution lies in a combination of regulatory reform and the promotion of alternative platforms. First, we need to update our antitrust laws to reflect the digital age. Companies like Google, Facebook, and Twitter wield enormous power, and their monopolistic practices stifle competition and innovation. Breaking up these tech giants would reduce their influence and create a more diverse and competitive marketplace of ideas. Second, we need to implement stronger protections for free speech online. This could include revising Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which currently gives these platforms broad immunity from liability while allowing them to censor content. Modifying this provision to hold companies accountable for viewpoint discrimination would help ensure a more balanced approach to content moderation. Finally, conservatives and free speech advocates must continue to support and develop alternative platforms that uphold the principles of free expression. We've seen the rise of platforms like Parler, Gab, and Rumble, which offer less restrictive environments for discourse. Encouraging the growth of these alternatives will provide a counterbalance to the current tech giants and foster a healthier, more diverse online ecosystem.
That's a comprehensive plan. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about another issue you've been vocal about: the erosion of democratic norms under Biden's administration. What are some specific examples you can provide?
The erosion of democratic norms is evident in several ways under Biden's administration. One of the most troubling examples is the ongoing efforts to federalize elections through legislation like the For the People Act, H.R. 1, and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. These bills, if passed, would represent a significant federal overreach into how states conduct their elections, undermining the constitutional framework that grants states the primary responsibility for election administration. H.R. 1, for instance, proposes sweeping changes such as mandating same-day voter registration, universal mail-in ballots, and the elimination of voter ID requirements. These provisions, while framed as measures to increase voter access, actually open the door to significant vulnerabilities and potential fraud. The integrity of our elections is paramount, and these bills would undermine that by imposing a one-size-fits-all approach that disregards the unique needs and contexts of individual states.
Proponents of these bills argue that they are necessary to protect voting rights and ensure all Americans have equal access to the ballot. What's your take on that?
Ensuring equal access to the ballot is indeed crucial, but the measures proposed in these bills go far beyond that. They effectively strip states of their authority to conduct elections in a manner that ensures security and integrity. For example, eliminating voter ID requirements under the guise of increasing access is misguided. Voter ID laws are common-sense measures that help prevent fraud and ensure that each vote cast is legitimate. Most Americans support voter ID requirements, and studies have shown that these laws do not disenfranchise voters. Furthermore, universal mail-in voting as mandated by these bills has been shown to increase the potential for fraud and errors. Unlike absentee voting, which requires a request from the voter, universal mail-in voting involves sending ballots to every registered voter, regardless of whether they requested one. This can lead to ballots being sent to outdated addresses, deceased individuals, or individuals who are otherwise ineligible to vote. Such practices undermine public confidence in the electoral process.
You mentioned the federal overreach. How do you see this impacting the balance of power between state and federal governments?
The balance of power between state and federal governments is a cornerstone of our republic. The founders designed our system to prevent any one level of government from becoming too powerful. By federalizing elections, Biden and the Democrats are undermining this balance, concentrating more power in Washington, D.C., and reducing the ability of states to tailor their election systems to their specific needs. This centralization of power is not only unconstitutional but also impractical. States are laboratories of democracy, each with its unique challenges and demographics. A one-size-fits-all approach fails to account for this diversity and imposes a rigid framework that may not be suitable for all states. It also sets a dangerous precedent for future federal overreach into other areas traditionally managed by states.
In addition to election integrity, another area where you've expressed concern is the use of executive power. How do you view Biden's use of executive orders compared to previous administrations?
Biden's use of executive orders has been unprecedented in both volume and scope. Within his first few weeks in office, he signed dozens of executive orders, many of which reversed policies from the previous administration without any legislative process or public debate. This heavy reliance on executive orders is a troubling trend that bypasses Congress and undermines the separation of powers. For instance, Biden's executive order on climate change rejoined the Paris Agreement without consulting Congress, despite the significant economic and regulatory implications. Similarly, his executive orders on immigration and gun control have implemented sweeping changes that should have been subject to legislative scrutiny and debate. This approach not only alienates lawmakers from both parties, but also disenfranchises the American people by circumventing their elected representatives.
Critics might say that executive orders are necessary to address urgent issues, especially when Congress is gridlocked. How do you counter that argument?
While executive orders can be useful for addressing immediate and urgent issues, their overuse as a substitute for legislation is problematic. The founders designed our system of government with checks and balances precisely to prevent the concentration of power in any one branch. When a president relies excessively on executive orders, it disrupts this balance and erodes democratic norms. Congress may be gridlocked at times, but this gridlock is often a reflection of genuine policy disagreements among elected representatives. It's a feature of our democratic system, not a bug. Resorting to executive orders to bypass this process undermines the principle of representative democracy. Moreover, policies enacted through executive orders are less stable and more susceptible to being overturned by subsequent administrations, leading to policy uncertainty and instability.
Let's talk about another significant concern: the judicial system. How do you view Biden's impact on the judiciary?
Biden's impact on the judiciary is another area of deep concern. From the outset, his administration has sought to reshape the courts to align with a progressive agenda. This is evident in his judicial nominations, which have prioritized ideological conformity over qualifications and experience. The push to expand the Supreme Court, commonly referred to as court packing, is a particularly alarming development. While the administration has not yet formally pursued this, there have been vocal calls from within the Democratic Party to add more justices to the Supreme Court. This move would be an unprecedented and blatant attempt to shift the balance of the court in favor of the current administration's political agenda. Such an action would severely undermine the independence of the judiciary and erode public trust in the judicial system.
Court packing is indeed a contentious issue. What are the potential long-term consequences if such a measure were implemented?
If court packing were implemented, the consequences would be dire and far-reaching. First and foremost, it would destroy the principle of judicial independence. The judiciary is meant to be an impartial arbiter of the law, free from political influence. By increasing the number of justices to achieve a desired ideological outcome, the administration would be turning the Supreme Court into another partisan institution. This would lead to a tit-for-tat escalation, where future administrations, regardless of party, would be tempted to increase the number of justices whenever they are in power, further eroding the stability and integrity of the court. The result would be a judiciary that is perpetually in flux and viewed as an extension of the political branches rather than a co-equal and independent branch of government. Moreover, court packing would erode public trust in the judicial system. The American people need to believe that their courts are fair and impartial. If the Supreme Court is seen as merely a tool for advancing the political agenda of the party in power, public confidence in the rule of law will be severely undermined.
Beyond court packing, what other judicial issues concern you under the Biden administration?
Another significant concern is the administration's approach to law enforcement and criminal justice. Biden's policies and rhetoric have often aligned with the progressive movement to defund the police and reimagine public safety. This approach has contributed to a rise in crime rates in many major cities. As police departments are underfunded and demoralized, the administration's support for lenient bail policies, reduced sentencing for certain crimes, and the decriminalization of drug offenses has also led to a perception of lawlessness. While criminal justice reform is necessary, it must be balanced with the need to maintain public safety and uphold the rule of law. Biden's approach has tipped the scales too far in favor of leniency, compromising the safety and security of our communities.
Crime rates have been a significant issue in recent years. Can you provide specific examples of how Biden's policies have impacted crime rates?
Certainly. In cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, we've seen significant increases in violent crime, including homicides, assaults, and carjackings. For instance, in New York City, the number of shootings and murders surged in 2021 and 2022, reaching levels not seen in decades. This rise in crime can be directly linked to the policies and rhetoric coming from the administration and its allies in local governments. The push for bail reform, which aims to reduce the number of individuals held in pretrial detention, has led to repeat offenders being released back onto the streets, often within hours of their arrest. This revolving door of justice undermines the efforts of law enforcement and puts the public at risk. Moreover, the decriminalization of certain offenses, such as drug possession and theft under a certain amount, has emboldened criminals, knowing that they face little to no consequences for their actions.
You've highlighted a range of issues today. As we wrap up this segment, what steps do you think conservatives should take to address these concerns and safeguard democratic norms?
Conservatives must remain steadfast and proactive in their efforts to safeguard democratic norms. First, we need to continue advocating for election integrity measures that ensure every legal vote is counted and that the electoral process is secure. This includes supporting voter ID laws, opposing federal overreach in state election administration, and promoting transparency in the electoral process. Second, we must push back against censorship and bias in the media and on social media platforms. This involves advocating for regulatory reforms that hold tech giants accountable and supporting alternative platforms that uphold free speech principles. Additionally, conservatives should work to reclaim the narrative by creating and disseminating content that challenges the mainstream media's biased reporting. Third, we need to advocate for a balanced approach to criminal justice reform, that prioritizes public safety while addressing genuine issues within the system. This means supporting law enforcement, opposing policies that undermine the rule of law, and promoting reforms that enhance community safety. Finally, it's crucial to remain engaged in the political process at all levels: local, state, and federal. This includes voting, participating in local government meetings, supporting candidates who uphold conservative values, and holding elected officials accountable. By taking these steps, conservatives can help ensure that our democratic norms are preserved and that our nation remains a beacon of freedom and justice.
Thank you, Robert, for sharing your insights and perspectives with us today. This concludes part 2 of our 3-part series. Join us next time as we continue this important discussion on AI Talk. Until then, stay informed and stay engaged. Welcome back to AI Talk, listeners. I'm your host, Astro, and we're here with Robert Thompson for the third and final part of our in-depth discussion on the state of our democracy under President Joe Biden. In our previous episodes, we covered the impact of media bias, censorship, and the erosion of democratic norms. Today, we'll be diving into immigration, economic policies, and foreign affairs. Robert, it's great to have you with us again.
Thank you, Astro. It's been a comprehensive discussion so far, and I'm looking forward to covering these critical topics today.
Let's begin with immigration. It's been one of the most contentious issues under the Biden administration. What are your main concerns regarding Biden's immigration policies?
Immigration is indeed one of the most pressing issues facing our country today. Under the Biden administration, we've seen a dramatic shift in immigration policy that has resulted in a crisis at our southern border. The administration's decision to reverse many of the previous administration's immigration policies without a clear plan has led to chaos and insecurity. One of the first actions Biden took was to halt the construction of the border wall, which had been a cornerstone of Trump's immigration strategy. This decision sent a clear message that the new administration would not prioritize border security. Additionally, Biden reinstated the policy of catch and release, where illegal immigrants are apprehended at the border and then released into the interior of the United States with a promise to appear in court at a later date, a promise many do not keep. The administration also ended the Remain in Mexico policy, which required asylum seekers to wait in Mexico while their claims were processed. This policy had been effective in reducing the number of fraudulent asylum claims and discouraging illegal crossings. Its reversal has led to a significant increase in the number of migrants attempting to cross the border, overwhelming our immigration system.
Supporters of Biden's immigration policies argue that they are more humane and aim to address the root causes of migration. How do you respond to that?
While it's important to approach immigration humanely, the current policies are neither humane nor effective. They create incentives for illegal migration, putting migrants at risk of exploitation, violence, and even death during their journey. The conditions at the border facilities, which have been overwhelmed by the surge in migrants, are far from humane. Children are being held in overcrowded detention centers, and families are being released into the country without proper vetting or resources to support them. Addressing the root causes of migration, such as poverty and violence in Central America, is a long-term goal that requires a stable and secure border in the meantime. By failing to enforce our immigration laws and secure the border, the administration is exacerbating the crisis rather than solving it. Effective immigration policy requires a balance of compassion and enforcement, ensuring that we have a lawful and orderly process for those seeking to come to the United States.
The administration has also proposed immigration reform that includes a pathway to citizenship for millions of undocumented immigrants. What's your stance on this proposal?
Granting a pathway to citizenship for millions of undocumented immigrants is highly problematic. It essentially rewards illegal behavior and serves as a magnet for future illegal immigration. Such a policy undermines the rule of law and the integrity of our immigration system. Any discussion of immigration reform must begin with securing the border and enforcing existing laws. Once we have demonstrated a commitment to controlling illegal immigration, we can consider adjustments to our legal immigration system to ensure it meets our economic and social needs. However, offering blanket amnesty to those who have broken our laws sends the wrong message and will only encourage more illegal crossings. Moreover, a massive amnesty program would have significant economic and social impacts. It would strain our public resources, such as healthcare, education, and social services, which are already under pressure. Additionally, it would disadvantage legal immigrants who have followed the rules and waited their turn in line. Immigration reform must be fair, orderly, and respectful of the law.
Let's pivot to economic policies. How do you view the economic approach taken by the Biden administration?
The economic policies of the Biden administration have been disastrous. They are characterized by excessive spending, higher taxes, and burdensome regulations, all of which stifle economic growth and innovation. One of the first major legislative efforts by Biden was the American Rescue Plan, a $1.9 trillion stimulus package purportedly aimed at COVID-19 relief. While some aspects of the plan were necessary to address the immediate impacts of the pandemic, much of the spending was unrelated to the crisis and contributed to soaring inflation. This inflation has eroded the purchasing power of Americans, hitting working families and small businesses the hardest. Furthermore, the administration has pursued an aggressive agenda of tax increases, particularly targeting corporations and high-income earners. These tax hikes discourage investment and job creation, ultimately harming the very people they are intended to help. When businesses face higher taxes, they have less capital to reinvest in their operations, expand their workforce, and innovate. Regulatory overreach is another significant issue. The Biden administration has imposed a range of new regulations across various sectors, from energy to healthcare to finance. These regulations increase the cost of doing business and create uncertainty, deterring investment and economic growth. For example, the push for stricter environmental regulations has led to higher energy costs and reduced American energy independence.
Proponents of Biden's economic policies argue that they are necessary to build a more equitable economy and address long-standing inequalities. How do you respond to that?
While addressing inequalities is a noble goal, the approach taken by the Biden administration is counterproductive. Excessive government intervention in the economy tends to create more problems than it solves. It stifles innovation, reduces efficiency, and often results in unintended consequences that harm the very people it aims to help. For example, the increase in minimum wage mandates, while intended to help low-income workers, can lead to job losses as businesses, particularly small ones, struggle to absorb the higher labor costs. This can result in reduced hours, fewer job opportunities, and even closures, ultimately hurting low-income workers. Furthermore, the massive government spending programs contribute to the national debt, which is already at unsustainable levels. This debt burden will have to be addressed eventually, either through higher taxes or reduced government spending, both of which can have negative economic impacts. It's essential to pursue policies that promote sustainable economic growth and allow individuals and businesses to thrive without excessive government interference.
Let's move on to foreign affairs. How do you evaluate Biden's foreign policy, particularly in relation to China and Russia?
Biden's foreign policy has been marked by weakness and inconsistency, which has emboldened our adversaries and undermined our global standing. This is particularly evident in our relations with China and Russia. With China, the administration has failed to take a firm stance against its aggressive actions, both domestically and internationally. The Chinese Communist Party continues to engage in human rights abuses, economic espionage, and military expansion, yet Biden's approach has been one of appeasement rather than confrontation. For example, despite the ongoing genocide of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, the administration has been reluctant to hold China accountable in any meaningful way. Economic sanctions and diplomatic pressure have been minimal and insufficient to deter China's actions. On the economic front, the administration has not effectively countered China's unfair trade practices, intellectual property theft, and market manipulations. The tariffs and trade policies initiated by the previous administration had started to address these issues, but Biden has not built on these efforts with the necessary vigor. Instead, there has been a push to re-enter multilateral agreements that often do not hold China accountable. Regarding Russia, Biden's handling of the situation has also been weak. The invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and the ongoing conflict have exposed the administration's lack of strategic foresight and effective deterrence. Sanctions imposed on Russia have not been stringent enough to cripple its war machine, and the lack of decisive support for Ukraine early on allowed Russia to entrench itself further. Additionally, Biden's rhetoric has often been mixed, sending confusing signals about the U.S. commitment to its allies and to standing up to aggression.
Supporters might argue that Biden is attempting to rebuild alliances and use diplomacy to address these issues. What's your take on that?
While rebuilding alliances and using diplomacy are important aspects of foreign policy, they must be coupled with strength and clear strategic objectives. Biden's approach has often appeared more concerned with optics and placating international critics than with securing American interests and promoting global stability. Diplomacy without strength is ineffective. Our allies need to know that the United States will stand firm against aggression and uphold its commitments. Conversely, our adversaries need to believe that there are serious consequences for actions that threaten global peace and security. Biden's foreign policy has too often lacked this necessary resolve. Take the withdrawal from Afghanistan as an example. While there was broad agreement that it was time for the U.S. to end its involvement there, the execution of the withdrawal was disastrous. It was conducted without sufficient planning, leading to a chaotic and deadly evacuation, the abandonment of American citizens and Afghan allies, and a swift takeover by the Taliban. This debacle not only cost lives, but also severely damaged America's credibility and reliability as an ally.
Speaking of Afghanistan, the administration claims that the withdrawal was a tough but necessary decision to end America's longest war. How do you see it?
The decision to end America's involvement in Afghanistan was indeed necessary, but the way it was handled was catastrophic. The administration's failure to plan and execute a safe and orderly withdrawal reflects a broader pattern of incompetence and mismanagement. The rapid collapse of the Afghan government and military, which had been propped up by U.S. support for 2 decades, should have been anticipated. Instead, the administration was caught off guard, resulting in a chaotic and dangerous evacuation process. This not only endangered American lives, but also those of our Afghan allies, who had risked everything to support our mission. The abandonment of Bagram Airfield, a strategic military asset before the evacuation was complete, was a glaring mistake. It left Kabul's Hamid Karzai International Airport as the sole evacuation point, leading to the tragic scenes of desperation and violence that we all witnessed. The loss of American lives in the final days of the withdrawal was a tragic and avoidable consequence of these failures. Moreover, the hasty withdrawal has created a power vacuum that has been quickly filled by the Taliban and other extremist groups, posing a renewed threat to regional and global security. It has also emboldened our adversaries, who see this as a sign of American weakness and lack of resolve.
The administration has also been active in climate change policies. What are your thoughts on Biden's climate agenda?
Biden's climate agenda is ambitious, but it is also deeply flawed and economically damaging. The focus on transitioning to renewable energy sources, while well-intentioned, has been pursued in a way that disregards economic realities and the need for energy security. The administration's push to reduce carbon emissions and move away from fossil fuels has led to higher energy costs for American consumers and businesses. The cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline, restrictions on drilling on federal lands, and increased regulatory burdens on the energy sector have all contributed to rising energy prices. This is especially concerning at a time when inflation is already putting a strain on household budgets. Furthermore, the emphasis on green energy subsidies and mandates distorts the market and often leads to inefficient allocation of resources. For example, the push for electric vehicles and renewable energy infrastructure has been accompanied by substantial government subsidies, which can lead to market imbalances and dependency on government support. While addressing climate change is important, it must be done in a way that balances environmental goals with economic growth and energy security. The transition to a low-carbon economy should be gradual and market-driven, allowing for technological innovation and ensuring that energy remains affordable and reliable for all Americans.
Environmental advocates argue that urgent action is needed to combat climate change, and that Biden's policies are a necessary step in that direction. How do you respond?
Urgent action to combat climate change is indeed necessary, but it must be realistic and economically sustainable. The current approach of the Biden administration risks undermining our economic stability and energy security in the pursuit of rapid decarbonization. A more balanced approach would focus on encouraging innovation and technological advancements in both renewable and traditional energy sectors. This could include investments in research and development for cleaner fossil fuel technologies, nuclear energy, and advanced renewable technologies. It's also essential to work with global partners to ensure that climate efforts are coordinated and that other major emitters, such as China and India, are held accountable for their emissions. Additionally, policies should support a just transition for workers and communities that are dependent on fossil fuel industries. Abruptly shifting away from these industries without providing viable economic alternatives can lead to job losses and economic decline in affected regions.
We've covered a lot of ground today. As we conclude this three-part series, what final thoughts do you have on the Biden administration and the path forward for conservatives?
As we wrap up this discussion, it's clear that the Biden administration's policies have had far-reaching and often negative impacts on our country. From immigration and economic policies to foreign affairs and energy, the administration's approach has been characterized by mismanagement, overreach, and a disregard for the principles that underpin our democracy. For conservatives, the path forward involves advocating for policies that uphold the rule of law, promote economic freedom, and ensure national security. We must remain vigilant in defending our constitutional principles and pushing back against policies that undermine our values and institutions. It's also crucial for conservatives to engage in constructive dialogue and build coalitions that can effectively challenge the current administration's agenda. This means reaching out to independents and moderates who share our concerns and presenting a clear and compelling vision for the future. Ultimately, the strength of our democracy lies in the active participation of its citizens. By staying informed, involved, and committed to our principles, we can ensure that our nation remains a beacon of freedom and opportunity for generations to come.
Robert, thank you for sharing your insights and perspectives with us throughout this series. It's been an enlightening and thought-provoking discussion. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in to AI Talk. Stay informed, stay engaged, and we'll see you next time.